Let's review something that we discussed in the first part of this presentation on the early Cold War. 1949 was a critical year because two events took place that deeply shocked many, many Americans. The first was that the Soviet Union gained the atomic bomb. We were no longer the only country that possessed this awesome weapon, and we were now potentially the targets of this bomb. And to make matters even worse, spies in the United States had helped the Soviets play a role in gaining it. That made Americans very, very fearful. Um, in response, the United States sought to develop a hydrogen bomb, which was hundreds of times more powerful than even the bomb that had destroyed the cities of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The second event that happened in 1949 was that about a quarter of the world's people came under communist rule. The Chinese Revolution, which was a result of a civil war that had been going on for decades, uh, was won by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communists. Their opponents, the nationalists, fled to the island of Taiwan, and that remains today uh, uh, what looks like a separate country, although both sides claim that they are the only legitimate government of all of China. So the vast majority of Chinese people came under communist rule, and it looked like we were losing the Cold War. Now, I mention these two events now because they form the context of what will happen in Korea just a few months later in 1950. Uh, the United States, having been shocked by these two events, was determined that if anything else came along, if communism tried to spread again, we would oppose it with enormous military force if necessary. That event happened in 1950. But let's look at the situation in Korea after World War II. Uh, Before this, there was no such thing as North Korea and South Korea. This was one society, one people, one language, one culture. But the Japanese controlled this Korean peninsula during the war. And when they surrendered, you have to surrender to someone when you surrender. The U.S. and the Soviets agreed that the Japanese would surrender to the Soviets in North Korea, in the northern half, north of the 38th parallel of latitude, and that they would surrender to the United States in the south. Now, the result was that uh, there were basically two countries, separate countries by 1949, the communist North and the capitalist South. North Korea was an ally of the Soviet Union, South Korea an ally of the United States. In June of 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South. At this point, the Chinese are not involved. The Soviets are not involved. In fact, there is evidence that the Soviets did not even know that the Korean dictator Kim Il-sung was going to take this important step. He had discussed the idea with them, but they didn't know when or even if for sure he was going to follow through on it. The Chinese and the Soviets, however, quickly support the North. Um, and the initial effect is that the North Koreans take the South Koreans by surprise. There were American troops in the South, but not nearly enough to meet the need. And the result was that by late July 1950, the U.S. and South Korean troops were driven back to this little area right here around Busan. And there was a great danger that they would be completely driven off the peninsula. Now, at this point, in October 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of American forces, launched a surprise attack. This was a very daring plan, uh, but it worked. Um, he took advantage of the U.S. naval superiority and took a large number of troops around to this area here called Incheon, which is not far from the South Korean capital of Seoul. Uh, he took the North Koreans by surprise. He had gotten in behind them, outflanked them, and then at that point, the Americans around Pusan launched their own attack. They moved northward, and the uh, North Korean forces were completely routed. And at that point, the United States moved all the way up to the battle with China. And for the only time in the Cold War, there were actual aerial dogfights between American fighters and Soviet MiG fighters over the Yalu River, which was the boundary between North Korea and China, and then also the boundary between North Korea and this little area here of Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time. Now, President Truman made a fateful decision at this point. You may remember that the policy of containment, which was American policy for decades during the Cold War, simply said that communism would not be allowed to spread. It didn't call for rolling back areas that the communists had already controlled. But Truman saw an opportunity here, and he attempted to reunify all of Korea under democratic, or well, not really democratic, but capitalist control, and certainly non-communist control. Now, General MacArthur was very aggressive. He predicted that the Chinese would not enter the war. That was the big concern, that we could handle the North Koreans, but if the Chinese were to enter the war, that would create enormous problems. But MacArthur confidently assured Truman that that would not happen. In fact, it did happen, however. In late November 1950 until January of 1951, there was an invasion by between 300,000 and 400,000 Chinese troops. At that point, MacArthur publicly threatened China with the atomic bomb, with nuclear weapons. He did this without the approval of the president, and this was way, way over the line. The job of a general is to implement American foreign policy, which is directed by the president, not to make or conduct foreign policy all by himself. And that is basically what MacArthur was trying to do. He didn't have a lot of regard for Truman. He had an enormous ego, and he basically became his own foreign policy expert. Sort of tried to, place himself in charge of this. Truman, in response to this, made a very unpopular decision. He fired MacArthur. Now, the initial reaction to this in the United States was outrage. MacArthur was seen as a hero. Truman was tying his hands. But after emotions calmed down a little bit and some other members of the military started getting involved, it became more and more clear that MacArthur had exceeded his authority, and more Americans gradually came to believe that Truman had made the right decision. The Chinese had, driven the Americans and South Koreans back until finally the two sides reached a kind of stalemate. So for the last 2 years of the war, this was almost like World War I style trench warfare. Neither side could break through. Now, and they were entrenched. Now, it's interesting to compare the geography of Korea with the geography of Vietnam. Look at the difference. In Korea, you have a peninsula that is surrounded by water here to the east and to the west. And this was a conventional war, uh, fought on ordinary battlefields. We knew who the enemy was. We knew where the enemy was. Uh, that is a type of warfare that the United States is well able to conduct. In Vietnam, on the other hand, uh, you have uh, water on one side, but you have jungle on the other. So this uh, front line here, which in Vietnam was known as the DMZ, and today, since the end of the war, this is the DMZ in Korea, demilitarized zone. Um, that was simple to defend in Korea, but impossible to defend in Vietnam because uh, the Northerners, North Vietnamese army would just go around it through the jungle, through tunnels, and this was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would infiltrate, invade the South. It was also unclear who the enemy was. So in these two hot wars that were part of the larger Cold War, the result in Korea was a tie. The result in Vietnam was a loss for the United States ultimately. In 1953, there were two new leaders of the superpowers. Uh, Truman decided not to run for re-election in 52. The winner of that election was Dwight Eisenhower, inaugurated in January of 53. And just a couple months later, Stalin died in March. So the result was that the old clashes, the old polarization between Truman and Stalin was over. And it was possible for Eisenhower to reach a truce at this point with North Korea, which they did in June of 1953, 3 years after the war had begun. There was a truce, but no peace treaty. There still is not a peace treaty. Um, so the Korean peninsula remains very tense today. There was a demilitarized zone set up, and even today, these are South Korean troops patrolling the demilitarized zone. And, you know, there have been threats and conflicts and tensions along this border ever since. And there are still American troops in South Korea, even though the Korean War happened or ended more than 60 years ago. One other item in this presentation was an enormous shock to the United States, and that was the Soviet Union figured out how to launch a satellite into space. It was called Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It didn't do anything but beep. It was about the size of a beach ball, maybe, and you know, it wasn't that heavy. It certainly had no weapons capability whatsoever. All it did was beep. But it was still an enormous shock to Americans, and some of them began to lose faith in the Eisenhower administration. The key behind this was developing, it was not the satellite, it was developing the rocket technology to break the bonds of gravity and actually get this into orbit, Earth orbit. This launched the space race, the one aspect of the Cold War, which was a race to develop satellites, a race to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, later a race to get to the moon. One of the most important responses to Sputnik was that it gave a huge boost to math and science and engineering, technology in American schools, what we would call the STEM subjects today, because there was a sense that, you know, oh, how could they be ahead of us? How could they beat us on this? And people began to question whether, you know, America really was as advanced and superior or ahead of other countries as most Americans had thought we were. Now, as I said, the rocket technology was key to Sputnik. Um, it's not such a threat to have a beach ball-sized beeper out in space, but the same rockets that could carry that up to space could also carry weapons, nuclear weapons, and that's where it really got scary. In 1957, the Soviet Semyorka missile, which launched Sputnik, had been perfected, and that had the capability of uh, carrying nuclear weapons. The United States tried some unsuccessful experiments. Some sarcastic journalists called one of them Flopnik rather than Sputnik when it uh, burned and exploded on the launch pad. But by 1959, the U.S. Atlas missile also gave the U.S. the same capability. Now, the result of this was the development of ICBMs. That stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. These were missiles that could be fired from one part of the world, get up into space, and then descend in any other part of the world, and they could carry nuclear weapons. And that increased the tensions of the Cold War enormously. Now, there were two responses to this from the Doves and the Hawks. The Doves were believers in peace, and they said, how do we achieve peace? And realize nobody wanted nuclear war. You'd have to be crazy to want that. But the Doves said peace is best achieved by disarmament, by cutting down on our nuclear weapons, if possible, getting rid of all of them, and along the way reducing tensions, so we're not, on this hair trigger hostile situation. Um, the Hawks said, well, we want peace too, but it's best achieved through strength and deterrence. So the more weapons we have, the less likely the other side is to attack us. Um, Deterrence means to prevent somebody from doing something. To deter them is to convince them that they really don't want to do this. So if we have strong enough weapons and enough of them, then they will be deterred from attacking us. Those were the two positions, and they're direct opposites. They're not compatible. You can't combine the two. Um, Out of this situation arose a policy which was called, sort of sarcastically, MAD, which stood for Mutual Assured Destruction. Here's how it worked. They would not attack us with atomic weapons because they would know that if they did, we would destroy them completely. And we would not attack them because we knew that if we did, they would destroy us completely. Mutual means both ways, in both directions. So mutual, assured, certain destruction was the policy. And the argument is that because both sides knew that if they attacked the other, they would be obliterated, the world actually, in a strange way, was safer. There is an element of truth to this, although there were times during the Cold War when it was way too close for comfort. The great fear in this environment was of a first strike capability. That means that one side would have so many weapons of such force, such power, that they could possibly knock out all the other side's weapons. And then that destroys mutual assured destruction. It destroys deterrence. Because if you think you can wipe out the other side completely, then you're not as worried that they can strike back. Now, that's what was the meaning of a first strike capability. So both sides wanted to avoid letting the other side get a first strike capability, and the result of that was a huge arms race. And in order to make sure that if they attacked us, we would have nuclear weapons that we could launch in response, we developed what was called the Nuclear Triad, and both sides had an arrangement like this. The triad means three here, that meant land, air, and sea. Land-based missiles like the ICBMs that you just saw in silos in out of the way places like North Dakota, for example. They were there and ready to be launched. But we also had B-52 bombers which carried nuclear weapons, and there were times when the Cold War was especially tense when those would be in the air 24/7, ready to be ordered to attack the Soviet Union. Not only that, but we had submarines carrying nuclear weapons, and that's the sea leg of the nuclear triad. And today, one American nuclear submarine equipped with nuclear weapons carries more destructive power than all sides used in all the battles of World War II put together. So that's the situation up and through the late 1950s, getting into the early 60s, and this would come to a head in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that is a subject for another time.